immediately stakes claim to the center, aiming to develop pieces harmoniously and restrict black's options. Instantly establishing a flexible central presence, this knight's sortie prepares to contest crucial squares and develop a dynamic pawn structure. Securing the center and preparing for rapid development, this push immediately challenges black's pawn structure and aims for a queenside advantage. Embracing hypermodern principles, this fianchetto signals an intention to control the center from afar and prepare for a dynamic kingside buildup. Securing the center with a knight, white prepares for a kingside fianchetto or a central pawn push, building harmonious piece development. Developing the bishop to its long diagonal instantly, stakes a claim on central squares and prepares for castling, solidifying the kingside. Unlocking the center, white boldly stakes a claim, inviting a rich positional battle with the king's Indian formation now firmly established. Opening the central diagonal for the bishop and preparing to challenge white's e4 pawn, this move solidifies black's pawn chain. Solidifying the center with knight development, this prepares for queenside expansion or central pawn pushes, maintaining flexibility. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount, allowing for more dynamic piece development and potential counterplay. Consolidating the pawn center, this development quietly prepares for kingside expansion and potential queenside pressure. This gambit unleashes immediate central pressure, challenging white's pawn structure and aiming for dynamic piece play. Capturing the pawn opens the d-file, potentially targeting the black king's safety. Reclaiming the pawn with the king opens lines for the queen and bishops, activating black's pieces for the center fight. Trading queens simplifies, entering a strategically calmer, yet potentially tense, middle game where piece harmony will be crucial. Recapturing with the rook immediately clears a key file for potential future action. A knight suddenly finds itself at a commanding central outpost, eyeing weaknesses and forcing black to carefully consider pawn structure and piece activity. A strategic retreat, rerouting the rook to a more active file, preparing for potential piece exchanges and a subtle pawn advance. Forcing a material exchange simplifies, opening lines for your pieces and potentially simplifying towards a favorable endgame where your knights can outmaneuver black's rook. Repositioning the bishop to this central square allows for better piece coordination and prepares for potential kingside action. Penetrating the queenside, this pawn advance creates immediate spatial pressure, forcing black to react and potentially weakening their pawn structure. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies the pawn chain and prepares to contest the open c-file, a crucial battleground. Targeting the bishop on f6 disrupts black's defensive pawn structure and prepares to gain an outpost on d5. Relocating the rook to the open d-file is a solid repositioning, aiming to contest control and prepare for potential exchanges in the center. Shattering the pawn structure, white initiates a favorable endgame by forcing a doubled pawn. Opening that b-file immediately is a bold declaration, creating a pawn majority on the queenside while accepting some structural weakness. Castling now secures the king, preparing for potential pawn structure shifts and piece development in the center. Developing the bishop to attack the knight, this move aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain active play. Sharpening central control, this maneuver aims to solidify white's knight's post and prepare for future kingside advances. Asserting control over the open b-file, black aims to create pressure on white's queenside pawn structure. Reinforcing the pawn chain, this maneuver aims to secure the queenside while preparing for potential pawn advances. Re-establishing the bishop's influence on the long diagonal solidifies black's piece placement. Gaining space on the kingside, this pawn advance aims to dislodge the bishop and potentially open lines for further initiative. Sacrificing the bishop to damage the pawn structure and open the king's path creates a dynamic, albeit risky, simplification. Opening the g-file creates dynamic possibilities, but weakens your king's structure, demanding careful defense and proactive piece placement. Unleashing the pawn storm on the kingside signals an aggressive attempt to disrupt white's solid pawn structure and open lines for the pieces. Opening the central file asserts dominance, creating dynamic possibilities for the rook's advance and potentially pressuring black's pawn structure. Activating the king opens up its potential for centralizing and supporting the remaining pawns. This strategic repositioning targets the open c-file, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain an outpost for the bishop. The bishop retreats to a more active diagonal, eyeing the weakened kingside pawn structure and preparing potential piece redistribution. Sacrificing the bishop simplifies the position, creating pawn weaknesses for black and opening a path for white's rook. Activating the king provides an active central presence, aiming to contest the open files and eventually support pawn advances. Consolidating the rook on the open file now supports the pawn structure and prepares for endgame maneuvering. Initiating a pawn lever to open lines and activate the rook on its new outpost. Unclogging the central files presents a clear advantage for white, simplifying into an endgame where pawn structure is paramount. Resuming the central pawns offers a chance to activate the rook along the semi-open file. Opening the e-file now grants crucial attacking potential against black's exposed king. Reclaiming pawn structure after the exchange solidifies your central presence and opens a pathway for counterplay. Reclaiming the central pawn opens the f-file, a crucial pathway for your rook in the ensuing pawn endgame. Pushing the passed pawn creates immediate pressure, forcing white to actively defend the c-pawn and potentially opening lines for black's rooks. Securing the king's escape route ensures it's no longer a prime target as the pawn structure breaks down. Unleashing the passed pawn's potential is paramount. Its march to promotion now begins in earnest. Retrieving the open file is the immediate priority, aiming to activate your rook before black's king can find safety. This knight's relocation is a desperate attempt to unblock the passed pawn and create counterplay, but it neglects the king's safety. The monarch abandons its sanctuary, inviting potential danger. Shifting the king opens lines for potential counterplay and asserts a presence in the center. Attempting to create space for the bishop, but overlooks black's pawns advancing power towards the center. Bringing your monarch into the fray initiates a daring chase for the pawn, gambling on active counterplay. The king bravely ventures forward, seeking active participation despite the exposed position. Shifting the king closer to the action embraces the emerging open files. Reinforcing the central pawn chain here signals a commitment to grinding out a positional advantage through a stable structure. The monarch bravely ventures further, seeking refuge or creating chaos by exploiting the open files. Securing the queenside pawn structure, preventing further kingside infiltration. This rook's arrival on the fourth rank forces white's king to adopt a more exposed posture, potentially leading to further pawn weaknesses. Shifting the king toward the center to engage in the pawn race and potentially create counterplay. The king's journey towards the queenside opens up new avenues for attack and potential pawn breakthroughs. The king abandons the safety of the corner for a precarious central outpost, inviting further complications in this unbalanced position. A bold attempt to activate the rook and disrupt white's pawn structure before settling into a passive position. Repositioning the king offers safety, anticipating the pawn's advance and a potential clash on the central files. Creating a human pawn chain to launch an assault on white's weakened kingside. Consolidating the king's safety becomes paramount as the queenside pawns advance. Pouncing on the unprotected queenside pawn, black seeks to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain material. Retrieving the extra pawn with the rook breaks black's initiative and simplifies into a winning endgame. The rook's excursion aims to disrupt white's queenside structure, but leaves the king exposed to immediate danger. Opening the file forces black to defend his loose pawns and restricts his rook's activity. The rook's excursion to the queenside is ambitious, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawns. The rook now infiltrates to the 7th rank, promising a relentless pressure on black's weakened pawn structure. Desperate checks are the last resort when facing overwhelming material disadvantage. The king cautiously sidesteps, preparing to defend the pawn structure from its less exposed position. Seeking to penetrate white's defenses and exploit the open c-file, black aims to activate the rook and pressure the weakened king. Exploiting the open c-file now, aiming to dislodge the lone rook and begin consolidating gains. Clearing the third rank unlocks the rook's power, though the king's exposure remains a significant concern. Securing the rook's potential outpost near the kingside offers a strategic advantage in the emerging pawn structure battle. The king's dash towards the queenside is a desperate gambit to join the pawn race, but it leaves it dangerously exposed. Seeking to reclaim the initiative, white forces black's king into a precarious central position by opening critical lines. Pushing this pawn forward creates a potential shelter for the king, a vital consideration as the enemy rook infiltrates. Securing the open file and initiating a counteroffensive, this thrust aims to dismantle black's king's fragile shelter. Repositioning the rook offers a crucial defensive screen and prepares for potential counterplay on the queenside. The rook ascends, seizing a critical open file to exert pressure and potentially support a queen's advance. The king's exposed position invites perpetual checks, forcing a draw rather than facing further peril. King seeks the safety of the queenside, escaping the open diagonals and potential threats from black's active pieces. The black monarch bravely ventures out, seeking an active role but exposing itself to potential dangers. Capturing the pawn simplifies things, leading towards an endgame where white's extra passed pawn should be decisive. Discovered check, the king is forced to a less secure square, opening opportunities for further pressure. Securing the king's escape route is paramount as the material advantage begins to wane. Sacrificing a pawn to activate the rook and threaten white's exposed king creates immediate chaos. Activating the rook to pressure the king's escape squares and potentially fork pieces. Pursuing the exposed king now becomes the primary objective. King's safety is paramount now, forcing black to shield their monarch from this impending check. The king's centralization is a desperate, yet understandable attempt to join the fight, though it leaves him dangerously exposed. The king ventures out, seeking active defense in this tense endgame scenario. A desperate attempt to create a passed pawn and disrupt white's consolidation. A calculated decision to centralize the king, aiming to coordinate defense and potentially launch a counterattack. Reaching for the kingside passed pawn creates a dangerous swathe of activity, aiming to disrupt the opponent's weakened pawn structure. Clearing a path for the rook to menace the pawn chain and pressure the isolated kingside pawns. The rook's relocation to the first rank liberates the king and prepares for a potential endgame transition. Securing the king's escape route is paramount as the board simplifies. The rook now occupies the open fourth rank, creating immediate pressure on white's pawn structure and offering potential for further infiltration. The king vacates the dangerous central files, seeking sanctuary on the flank. Challenging the pawn structure with a pawn thrust opens new avenues for counterplay. Relocating the king to a more active square seems prudent to support potential counterplay. Filing the open G file now contests crucial central control. Asserting control over the **C file ** presents a crucial opportunity to disrupt black's pawn structure. Opening the C file promises a desperate fight for space, but the pawn sacrifice is perilous. Challenging black's rook to abandon its defensive post and forcing it to retreat strategically. Shifting the king's position to G5 presents a potential target, as it now looks towards the central action. Actively defending the passed pawn now seems vital, as the opponent's king looks quite exposed. Seeking to create an outpost for the rook on the fifth rank, aiming to restrict white's pawn advances. The rook's repositioning offers a dual threat to the isolated pawns and prepares to advance along the open file. Seeking to solidify king position and perhaps find active counterplay by consolidating forces. Securing the central pawn advance is paramount, preventing further black encroachment. Prioritizing safety, the king finally retreats from the perilous central skirmish. The white king cautiously advances, seeking sanctuary amidst the unfolding chaos and preparing to support the pawn push. Embracing a daring pawn thrust to break free, the king's safety now hangs precariously in the balance. The king repositions, preparing to support the pawn advance. Pushing the passed pawn is the only hope, otherwise the rook's infiltration spells doom. Guarding the critical 7th rank, the rook solidifies white's defensive setup against black's encroaching pawns and active king. Securing the d-pawn's advance solidifies a crucial outpost in this complex endgame struggle. Securing the central file after a protracted struggle provides a glimmer of hope amidst the deteriorating position. A desperate attempt to gain a tempo for the king, but the passed pawn is still far from promotion. The king bravely ventures forth, confronting the pawn's structure's impending cascade. A desperate attempt to create a passed pawn on the queenside before white's own advance seals the deal. Securing the crucial 7th rank with the rook aims to stifle any remaining opposition activity. The monarch's flight path is becoming quite perilous with this advance. The rook solidifies its grip on the open file, a crucial defensive stance, opening the door for the rook to infiltrate and threaten the passed pawn's advance.